Good afternoon, YouTube. Still at the Johnston farm, and Indian Bear, we just passing by Lock 8 south on the Miami and the Erie Canal.
Yes.
On a boat ride right now. It's been very good. Feel free to go onto YouTube probably Monday, type in the Johnston farm and and the Indian Barrel, and feel free to share this video. Wow, that is wild right there. That's really interesting. That's really interesting, that old canal boat. They're pulling the horse back this way. We're going back south, I believe. Yeah, we're going back south again. So yeah, this is really interesting. I'm really glad I made this trip today.
They also built a dam across the Great Miami River. It's called the Old State Dam. The reason for that was that you have no water source to get the boat started from this location. And so we built a dam across the Great Miami River. It backs up water, and then about 1 o'clock on the circle, there was what was called a guard lock. And the guard lock is a smaller version of a lock, and it allowed us to bring water in from that little reservoir that we built on the river to help boats get started to go south toward Cincinnati from here. So in 1837, that was the only water source that was available. And there's a whole series of low water dams built from Cincinnati all the way up here to do the same thing. We build a section, build a dam, put water in it, and move on north. So the first thing you have to remember is Ohio, not a flat state. To come off the Ohio River to the highest location in this part of Ohio, you come up 512 feet off the Ohio River. Okay. And once you get to town of Lockington, which is just north of here, about 2 miles north of us now, you hit the front edge of what's called the Laramie Summit or the Laramie Plateau. That's the highest piece of ground in this part of Ohio. The Laramie Summit runs from Lockington in southern Shelby County up to New Bremen in Auglaize County, and once you hit New Bremen, then the slope starts to drift down toward Lake Erie. Eventually falls about 221 feet down to the level of Lake Erie. So number one, Ohio not flat. Think about Ohio as being a large pyramid with the top kind of shaved off, and then you get a better picture of what it's like to operate in Ohio. It becomes very important when you remember this canal works basically off of something you learned in 6th grade science. Water flows downhill. Gravity is exactly the point. No magic, no pumps. This is all gravity fed. So you have to understand those things as you start to build them. And then we get into the final stage of building, in the last stage, that really comes into play with how water flows and where it goes. So let me drop back to the story about the building of the northwest section of the canal. In 1816, Indiana becomes a state, and they want to have a canal. And so the canal that was built in Indiana was called the Wabash Erie, named after the most famous river and the longest river in Indiana. What you don't realize is that some of the branches of the Wabash come into Ohio. And so the Indiana Canal Commission decides to build the Wabash Erie. They start near Fort Wayne, and they come into Ohio following a branch of the Wabash River. It comes into Paulding County, Ohio. There's a buckeye tree, by the way. If you haven't seen buckeyes, buckeye's the first tree that starts to lose its leaves in the fall. And so we're getting ready to, I can take a story about that one too. So we'll come back to see how many stories I can work into that. But Indiana starts to build the Wabash Erie Canal, and it's building in an easterly fashion following a branch of the Wabash River. Comes into Paulding County, Ohio, and the northern-bound Miami Erie meets up with the eastern-bound Wabash Erie Canal, and they meet in a little place in north-central Paulding County. Has a cute little name for a town. It's called Junction. Isn't that a great name for a town? So in Junction, and by the way, Junction becomes a very notorious little place because you have canal boats coming out of Indiana as well as canal boats coming out of Ohio, and you have crews with lots of time on their hands, and you can take it from there. So, so at Junction, the two canals come together, and they follow the Auglaize River up to Defiance, and at Defiance, they have to push the canal boats across the Maumee. They pick up the canal on the northern and western side of the Maumee, and that becomes the path down to Lake Erie. Now here's where the story gets kind of dicey. When Ohio becomes a state in 1803, most of the boundaries were pretty well set, and we had a pretty good idea where the Ohio River was, and where Lake Erie is. And Pennsylvania's already state, so we don't have to worry about the eastern edge of Pennsylvania. The part of Ohio's boundaries that were not very firmly set were the ones in northern Ohio, between Ohio and the Michigan Territory. Well, the original plan was that they would draw a line between the lowest level of Lake Michigan, which you think of maybe Chicago or Gary, Indiana, something like that, and the lowest level of Lake Erie. So when you draw that line, what it does is it puts the mouth of the Maumee River, which is going to be the ending point of this canal, that puts that in the Michigan Territory. Now we have a problem. Ohio very much wants to own the mouth of the Maumee River because everybody knows we're going to have a lot of money's going to be made there. It's going to be a very rich place. Lots of activity going to happen there, and we can't turn that over to the territory of Michigan. After all, we're a state and they're a territory. What do they got to fight about? So Ohio says, well, we're just going to go and take it. We're a state. So we send the survey team up to resurvey the northern boundary of Ohio, and everybody's pretty happy in Ohio.
When did Michigan become a state?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
That's part of the story. And so what happens is that the Ohio people are pretty happy that we're going to get the mouth of the Maumee River, we're going to control the canal, lots of money to be made up there. But the people in Michigan were not very happy. And so when the survey team arrives and they start doing their work, they have the survey team arrested, they haul them off to the Tecumseh, Michigan for trial for trespassing. So that makes Ohio angry, so we send out the Ohio militia, we're going to rescue the survey team. And so Michigan says, we'll show you, we're going to send out our militia. And so we have two sets of militia out looking for each other just south of what now is Toledo in the Great Black Swamp. And they're kind of stumbling around in that area. The good news is they never found each other. Supposedly the only casualty was a cow that got shot. But the year is 1837, and Andrew Jackson is the president, and he's asked to intervene in the process. He thinks for a second, and he says, I'm running for re-election, and Ohio's a state, they can vote for me. But Michigan's a territory, they can't vote for me. Guess what? I'm going to go with Ohio. So Ohio gets to push the boundary of Ohio up to almost its current location. It's been altered several times since then. But we pushed up so that the western bay of Lake Erie becomes the edge of where Ohio's boundary is. And just to make Michigan a little bit happier, Michigan gets to become a state. That was the threshold for Michigan. And then to make sure that Michigan doesn't have any other things to protest, we give Michigan a piece of land that looks like it should probably belong to Wisconsin.
What's this river junction right here? What's that?
The piece of land is called the Upper Peninsula. That's how the UP comes to Michigan, is 1837. That's very much a canal story. So if you think the argument between Michigan and Ohio is a football story, you're about 150 years too late. That's very much a canal story. And so Ohio gets the mouth of the Maumee, and Toledo is history, and you know what's going on from there. That's a little tributary that kind of comes in here. It's kind of a swampy area. Okay. It really doesn't contribute much water to us, but it's not worth worrying about. So even during the canal period, it was not. The final section of the canal built is really from our 1837 location up to Paulding County. Got some real interesting building stories that go on in this part of the story. Just north of us, we have a hill near the town of Lockington. The hill forces canal boats to go up 70 feet in elevation and only 500 linear yards. Not something the big heavy canal boats do. And so the engineer thinks it over and decides, well, maybe we'll build some locks. So we built 5 locks up the hillside at Lockington. It's the single steepest climb on any place on the Miami Erie Canal. And so at Lockington, within 1 mile of Lockington, there's actually 6 locks, a bridge over the Laramie Creek, and 5 locks up to the hillside. So it takes canal boats maybe 45 minutes to an hour for each lock. So many times passengers or the crew would actually get out and walk into Lockington, and they'd go to the local tavern or other establishments to see what was going on. And consequently, Lockington, as well as a lot of other little towns like that, become kind of notorious. In the town of Lockington during the canal period, they had 22 bars and 12 brothels. So it's a lot of commerce going on in Lockington during the operation of the canal. The rumor is that when the boats come through Lockington, the wives come along because it's time to look out what's going on. So pretty rough and tumble place. I think Lockington today maybe is 200 people. It's a city little village. Basically, it's now. The second hill story in this section is another high terrain story. Mercer County, Allen County, up that way. You where Spencerville is on 66. Spencerville becomes important because we can't go around the hill and we have to cut through that hill. And so at Spencerville, the workers dig a trench that is 69 feet from the top of the hill to the bottom of the canal bed. It takes the workers 5 years to dig only 1.25 miles of the canal. Okay. Pretty heavy digging. Wow. This is where the immigration story comes back. The workers are German and Irish. The Germans don't like the Irish, and the Irish hate the Germans. And so we have all day long they're working hard to dig this canal, and at night they're fighting. And so we have to send the militia up to keep them apart. Guess whose militia gets charged with going up to keep the Germans and the Irish apart? It's Johnston's militia from Piqua. Has to go up and do the honors on the canal. So it's a tough old story, and you can still see deep cut at Spencerville if you're interested in that kind of canal history. The third and final thing that we have to do to make the canal operate is once again back to that good old thing that we learned in the 6th grade. It's called gravity. Water flows downhill. And so we have to have our water sources at the highest elevations of Ohio so that water can go down both sides of the slope. So we decided to build 3 big water towers. The water towers are called Grand Lake St. Mary's at Mercer and Auglaize County. It's called Lake Laramie in Shelby County. And now we call it Indian Lake, but back then it was called the Lewiston Reservoir in Logan County, Ohio, near Bell Fountain, a little northeast of Bell Fountain. So those 3 reservoirs have to be built. And depending on how the water is channeled, it goes down one of the other slopes. For instance, the water from Grand Lake St. Mary's is on the northern side of St. Mary's, and so consequently that water was used to go down to Toledo. That was the northern water going to the northern slope. On the southern slope, we use the water from Indian Lake. It comes through what's called the Sydney Feeder to Lockington, and then it comes south, and it's all downhill from here to Cincinnati. And the water from Lake Laramie really kept the high terrain section, that 22-mile high plateau section, keeps water in that section, keeps it active there. And you can still see where the water came into that section right between Fort Laramie and Minster on State Route 66. You can still see the superstructure which allowed that to happen. So we get those water towers all built. The canal opens up in the spring of 1845, and we start to be able to use the canal all the way from Cincinnati to Toledo. But only 6 years after the canal opens up, now the railroads are pushing into this part of the world, and the railroads start to interfere in the amount of produce that's being carried on boats and things. And so by 1851, the railroads start to affect the profit margin that the canal boats are seeing. And by 1860, the railroads have moved in sufficient strength that the whole canal system in Ohio loses money for the first time since about 1829. So it's an interesting story. Now the canals live much longer than that, but they never are the economic force that they have been prior to that time. The real serious money on the canals in Ohio are made from about late 1820s to the late 1850s. And believe me, there's some very serious money that's made in that period of time. So it's a neat, interesting story. The canals do a couple things. I'll give you a couple examples of what happens locally so you get some feel for the power that the canals have. My home address is Piqua, and of course the site address is Piqua. The town of Piqua in 1836, the population was about 2,500 people. And so the canal was being dug through this section, but it's not yet open. And in 1837, we opened this section of the canal up, and Piqua's population has doubled in 1 year.
Well, what year was that?
From 1836 to 1837. Okay, so people are coming in droves.
From Cincinnati and very...
Sure. And they're coming in from the north as well, but they can't get here on the canal.
Can I also ask you another angle of the story? I don't know how knowledgeable you are. That you mentioned the German-Irish hostility. Were they extremely hostile in each other's Catholic churches? Because I know they established their own...
We didn't have the same churches. If you go north of here, well, you can name the town. For instance, Minster is a German Catholic town, whereas New Bremen is a German Protestant town, and other towns are Irish Catholic towns.
But as far as was the hostility shared amongst the German Catholics versus the Irish,
Well,
Catholics, was that part of the hostility?
It was a three-way split because the German Catholics didn't like the German Protestants any more than they liked the German Irish.
So they disliked them more than they disliked the Irish?
Yeah, I think it was equal. They just didn't care for each other, and it resulted in hostilities on several occasions. Let me give you a couple more examples of what happened in the canal. From the year 1837 to the year 1847, the town of Piqua alone, and we know this from records because Piqua had a toll booth on the canal. From 1837 to 1847, Piqua alone imports 1 million pounds of nails. We're building houses and churches and buildings. It's a boom time for this part of the west central Ohio. And not only Piqua, but it's towns south and towns north of here. Probably the nicest compliment goes to the farmer. In 1840, we know that a barrel of flour, I have a barrel sitting here on the deck, and a barrel of flour in this part of Ohio was selling on average for about $1.25 a barrel. So a farmer could sell it locally for $1.